Thank you, Professor Eifort, and thank you, the Baha'i Association, for inviting me to be here with you. I must say, I've had only a very brief acquaintance with the Baha'i community through my work at the United Nations, where you know you have a very active and very highly regarded liaison office. I've had the chance and the privilege of participating in a few of their meetings at the UN. But I find, even in this brief acquaintance, that the goals that you pursue, the aims that you have, are very much in tune with the ideals I have, with the dreams I have, and so that when I am with you, I feel less alone. Because very often, moving in international circles, people are very much stuck in the status quo, very much stuck in trying to preserve what there is, and afraid to look ahead, and even if they see ahead, they pretend that there is nothing wrong. Yet there is plenty that there is wrong, and there's plenty that we can do about it. And I think your community, worldwide, and wherever it exists, is one of the few groups of people who represent the positive signs which can move us from one age into the next. Now, I cannot pretend to put what I have in mind into the context of your thinking. I don't know enough about it. But I would like anyway to begin with a few passages which struck me as being particularly relevant to the kind of concerns, very deep concerns that I have, which I would like to share with you. So let me first of all just read to you some passages that you must know by heart. But let me just try to recall this as a preface, as an overall framework for what I would like to say. In that little leaflet, that one page that has been distributed in your registration package, there is the following statement, and I will read just a few sentences from it. It talks about the principle of oneness. And it says that this principle of oneness implies an organic change in the structure of present-day society, a change such as the world has not yet experienced. It calls it the consummation of human evolution, an evolution that has had its earliest beginnings in the birth of family life, its subsequent development in the achievement of tribal solidarity, leading in turn to the constitution of the city-state, and expanding later into the institution of independent and sovereign nations. This process, it is said, is not only necessary, but inevitable, and that its realization is fast approaching. Let me not read any further, since it's there in front of you, and you know it, this text, much more than I do. However, these couple of ideas have struck me very deeply. Let me supplement this with a quotation, likewise from Shoghi Effendi, that is given in the booklet in a monograph of Dr. Danesh on the violence-free society. And he quotes Shoghi Effendi, and let me just read that two sentences for you also. The long ages of infancy and childhood through which the human race had to pass have receded into the background. Humanity is now experiencing the commotions invariably associated with the most turbulent stage of its evolution, the stage of adolescence, when the impetuosity of youth and its vehemence reach their climax, and must gradually be superseded by the calmness, the wisdom, and the maturity that characterize the stage of manhood. It is my dream and my hope that we can work and eventually achieve this stage of manhood, stage of humanhood, which will be calm and peaceful and unite all of the peoples of the earth in a global family. But I want to underline to you, and this is what my talk is going to be about, this phrase within this remarkable sentence, that we are now experiencing the most turbulent stage of human evolution. It is true, and I'm afraid it will become more and more true in the next 10 years or 15 years. From all the evidence that I have, from all the international documents, all the plans, all the strategies that I have seen in the UN and outside, I cannot avoid the conclusion that the present system, and I'm talking about the international socio-economic, technical, industrial system, this system is heading into a crisis, toward a watershed, that there is no turning back. But I don't want to preach doomsday. When I say this, I don't mean that this is the end of the road. What I mean to say is that this is the end of an age. And I hope that this is the end of the age of adolescence. And it could be the beginning of the age of manhood. But for that we have to act. And we have to act already. Because if there is only one word about which I would express some doubt, is that this one word of inevitably reaching the next stage. Perhaps when these words were written, the tremendous powers that humankind has unleashed were not known, could not have been known. It could not have been known that now we can kill ourselves off and all other species in the world with a push of a few buttons. It was not known, but that we now know, that we can practically destroy the life support systems of this earth, of this planet, which is our habitat, which is our home. So what I want to impress on you is not to put blind faith into the coming of the next age, but to work for it. Because there is an alternative, a dreadful alternative, that we won't make it. However, I want to point out to you what we might expect as we move toward the 1990s and into the 1990s, and what choices we have to make, what prospects we will face. Because we are not heading toward an epoch which is predetermined. We are not destined either one way or another. I believe we have choices, and the choices will be increasingly up to us to make. This is my main thing. The choices will be able to be exercised at a time when the present system, this age of adolescence, crumbles around us, as I believe it will. Now, this fact that we can make a choice in the midst of a crisis, this fact is not only a hunch. It is now a well-documented, well-established scientific insight, applying to biology, applying to physical and chemical systems, applying to the evolution of the universe as a whole. I will not want to give you here a lecture on the theories of change and evolution. Just want to remind you of a few things. The idea that evolution is smooth and it's gradual has by and large been abandoned even in the life sciences. Very recently, only as of about 1980, that this turnabout has occurred. The idea that natura non facit saltum, that nature does not make leaps, which was a main tenet of Darwin, has gone out the window. In fact, now we talk about punctuated equilibrium, or saltatory versions of the Darwinist thesis. In other words, that when evolution occurs, macroevolution, the creation of a new species, and we in society also we are talking in a sense about the creation of a new species, this comes about when the existing dominant species becomes destabilized, and then a small, up till then, almost dormant or peripheral species can all of a sudden come, spread, and take over. Make the analogy. Make the analogy even with the Baha'i group. There will come a time, and I'm convinced it will be before the end of this century, when the dominant systems, institutions of today will crumble, when those peripheral movements that are today suppressed and persecuted will have their day. And we must hope that there are movements such as yours which will carry the day, and not inhuman and dictatorial and terrorist type of movements. And this is why we must prepare already. In another facet, coming from systems theory, since your chairman has mentioned that I was interested in this area and I've written a number of books on that, we likewise have come to the conclusion that no system evolves in the absence of what is termed a fluctuation, a very major fluctuation, sometimes called a mega fluctuation, this fluctuation which comes either from the environment or is generated by the system must destabilize the existing corrective, self-stabilizing mechanisms of that system, so that the system then can move into a new mode, into a new kind of existence, into a so-called new dynamic regime. Again, I won't enlarge on this. If you would have questions about it, I'll be glad to reply to them. But the evidence that this is occurring in the universe at large, that this can be reproduced in the laboratory, this is increasing. Again, since the mid-70s, the laboratory experiments have been coming one after another. In the late 70s, a Nobel Prize was given for the discovery to Ilya Prigozhin. We are now facing a new shift in our ways of thinking about change. Change is not smooth. It's not gradual. It's sudden. It moves through crisis. It can be catastrophic, but it can move to us also to the next plateau, the next level of evolution. And it must be our hope that change applied to human society will not be catastrophic, but will move us to that next plateau, which represents the maturity of our species. Let me move to a little bit more empirical facets, and let me tell you why I believe that we are approaching such a watershed. We have had in this epoch, in this century, periods of war, periods of a financial collapse. We also had epochs of progress, of cooperation, and of stability. But if we are to draw a balance sheet, we would find that the troubled periods are accelerating, the instabilities are mounting, and if the trends continue, we may reach the point of no return. We might be reaching a series of interconnected crises in which one thing feeds into another, which no Marshall Plan, no Apollo mission, no effort made by the present administrative and political systems could be of help, could prevent from occurring. The stakes are now, of course, the highest that we have ever confronted. We have now 4.555 billion people. By 1990, we will have 5 billion. By the year 2000, we should have 6.5 billion people, according to median projections of the UN. We are at the present time concerned that the extra pressures put up by these many people in a tribally oriented society, global society. By that I mean nation states that are inward looking, that are holding on to the sovereignty as though it was God-given, as though nothing else existed, that talk about interdependence but fear their neighbors and try only to relate to one another to their own advantage. That in this epoch we may find ourselves in a situation of a breakdown. We are fearing that this would lead to a war, to a confrontation in which nuclear arms could be used. This is a possibility. But I want to emphasize to you, although it may sound very heretical, that an excessive fascination almost, I'm using this almost in a clinical sense, with the nuclear spectre can blind us to another factor. The factor that if we don't kill ourselves off, the continuation of the present trends will lead us into a breakdown. It's not enough to do away with nuclear arms. Of course we must do that, because the presence of nuclear arms is an ever-present danger. In this epoch, it will remain a danger in the next plateau of civilization also. But we must not be blinded by fearing the nuclear flash to the extent that we disregard the trends, the macro trends, the world problematic, which heads us straight into a situation which will be very, very difficult to master, which I think we will not be able to master with our present institutions. On the surface, let me go ahead now a little bit in time. The 1990s, I think, will be a period of mounting tensions and self-reinforcing crisis. These crises will bring about social unrest, political coups, and all that go with them. They will come about despite the affirmation of our economists, a certain breed of economists, the equilibrium economists, that all these equilibria are temporary in nature and they are self-curing. That all we have to do is let the market operate and it will take care of all our problems. This, in fact, is one of the most dangerous kind of beliefs because it encourages inaction. It says, let things go on the way they are, they'll take care of themselves. And signs of an economic recovery can give us the false sense of illusion that all things are all right. But look at the global picture. They are far from all right. We are going to have, in the last 25 years of this century, about 2.23 billion people, almost 2.25 billion new people entering the world. That's the increment in human population. According to all population projections, this is the largest increment humanity has ever had, and possibly the largest that it will ever have. Afterwards, even if we don't kill ourselves off, even if we could maintain the present system, the next increment, in the year 2000, 2025, would be lesser because there wouldn't be so many young people. The age distribution would be different. These people are coming into the world in the poor areas. By the year 2000, if present trends continue, over 80% of the world population would live in what we now call the third world. The fastest population increases are occurring in the poorest regions. They would need an infusion of capital, infusion of education and skills, a creation of infrastructure and of jobs of a tremendous magnitude. We know what is needed. For example, the latest projections of the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, says we would have to quintuple, multiply by a factor of 5, investment in food production in the developing countries. Similar projections apply when you talk about health, when you talk about employment, when you talk about industrial distribution, etc. There are no signs that anything like this can happen. In fact, per capita food production has been decreasing by 10% over the last decade in Africa. It is decreasing in many countries in Asia and in Latin America. More and more countries are becoming dependent on food from the outside. And when they do so, they are becoming dependent on two things: on the availability of food and on the money with which to buy it. Now, both will be impossible to have in the coming years. Why? First of all, they get more and more indebted, these countries. So they will not have capital. They do not already have capital. They might be facing a series of bankruptcies. And secondly, the amount of food that could be traded in world markets is diminishing. The latest projections, which came to light only in some very highly qualified professional computerized studies of U.S. agriculture in a meeting of the Club of Rome about a month ago in Budapest, show that by the year 2000, the U.S. will not have any food to export due to a number of reasons: price of energy, the paving under of productive land, the erosion of topsoil, the increasing need for fertilizer and for mechanization, and so on. It is quite likely that we will not be able to feed 6.5 billion people by the turn of the century. And this is only one of the many facets of the problem. Let me give you a brief scenario of how things might go. I hope that they don't. On the other hand, in a sense, I hope that also some kind of a breakdown is coming, because I do not see a possibility of creating a new world, a better world, unless the present institutions suffer this kind of a dissolution. I don't think you can build a new world before the old one has disappeared. And now we are in a global situation, and this has to happen globally, and it probably will happen globally. Let me give you just, even if it might seem a little bit boring, on the one hand, if you're not interested in finance. If you are, it might seem too dramatic, but anyway, let me give you a little scenario. Think of it that you are now in the late 1980s. You will find that a number of Latin American countries, let's say Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and Venezuela, cannot anymore repay their obligations. They get together, they form a common front, this is being discussed already, and they say that this is all right as sovereign nations. They have such domestic problems that they cannot simply afford to export capital. Rural people are coming into their cities, and the cities are already the breaking point. You know the projections for the big cities. Mexico City, 31 million people by the year 2000, now has probably 15 million or so. There's no way Mexico City can provide this water and sanitation, not to mention power and jobs and other services, more than 18 or 20 million, and that will come in a few years. Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, all these cities are growing to tremendous proportions, elsewhere in the world as also. But let me give you this scenario. The rural areas fall into poverty even more than they are today. The government, in order to save their necks, at least for a few more years, they must take some immediate measures. The first and only thing they can do is try to use whatever capital they have to quell the domestic unrest by creating investments in their own countries and not exporting the capital in the form of repayment of their past debts. Now, the other countries, when this happens, are likely to follow suit. And there are several dozen countries that are facing bankruptcy in the world. They're also Eastern Europe, but the majority are in Asia and in Africa, in addition, of course, to Latin America. They are not likely to find themselves in a position of facing armed forces to force them to pay back their debts. Why? Because one country, perhaps, you can invade, or to use a proper term, you can conduct a rescue mission. You can't do this with 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen countries. Marines won't help. So, in the early 1990s, it's quite conceivable that we will have a massive financial breakdown in the world. This will have serious political consequences in the countries involved. It will have serious political consequences in the creditor countries, not the least in the US, because there have been enormous sums of money involved. The banks will want to have the government to bail them out. Again, it's very likely that the government will not increase public spending to such an extent as to bail out Chase Manhattan or Morgan Guaranty Trust, saying that you gave the money in the first place, now you have to shoulder the consequences. The funds available, let me not get into too much technicalities, but the funds available to the International Monetary Fund, no matter what you read in the papers, will be enough for the next 2 years, even if you increase it. If you double it, it will be enough for 3 years. The amounts of the sums are so massive and increasing so rapidly what are needed that simply they are not enough. There's not enough there to supply this. You would have to turn OPEC into a humanitarian club in order for them to supply even a portion of the needed monies. And yet I visit very frequently the Middle East. I come recently from Kuwait, for example. And in all my discussions there, I see no indications of them turning into a humanitarian club. In fact, they are very much aware of the fact, if you listen to them, that they are in a very poor and tight situation. They happen to have the largest per capita income in the world, but they say, well, this is false, because what we are doing, we are selling a non-renewable resource which is going to run out, and then where will we then be? And that's actually a very good question. Where will they be? Because there is a real distinction between development and economic growth. They have economic growth, but no development. Once the money dries up, they'll be back where they were before the money started coming in. Except it's a lot of things rusting on their necks. So I don't think OPEC will help. I think, in fact, OPEC unity might suffer in the process. I don't think the European community can help. I don't think the US will help. The Soviet Union certainly won't help. So we will have a situation in which there will be major political unrest. The political spectrum will shift from left to right rather rapidly. New leaders will come and make their appearance, and they will preach the doctrines of national unity, possibly by trying to distance themselves from the countries on which they were dependent. You can have any one of a dozen scenarios. None of them look very good in this case. However, the interdependence of the system is such that the breakdown is going to create a crisis of worldwide proportions. Hyperinflation, very likely to occur almost in all currencies. Most countries hold their reserve currencies, their major monies, in dollars. If the U.S. is going to print more money to cover the needs, the value of the dollar is going to go down. It's doing well now, but this is not yet in the face of a situation which I'm painting to you now. There could be extremism of all kinds. If we are lucky, then a war will not erupt. The war will be totally useless under such circumstances. You cannot fight poverty with bombs. The situation, I could paint it to you in more detail, I don't want to take that much time for that, would be chaotic. There would be massive migrations. The migration in West Africa that we've heard about recently, where one country decided to expulse its people who were not their own nationals. This could happen in elsewhere, in Asia, elsewhere in Africa and Latin America. We could have people in the millions moving across borders. Again, it's not likely that any kind of peacekeeping force would be able to maintain order. See what happens in a small country like Lebanon when you try to create order, when there is internal unrest, when there's internal division, and internal divisions are going to grow. So we reach a point, probably by the late 1990s, where the political system, the techno-industrial system, the financial system, as we know it, is in ruins. Now, people, if they are honest, will tell you, who are dealing with these things, that this is very likely. They don't tell you, because this looks like a doomsday prophecy, it looks like the end of the world. But I'm telling you, and I think to this public particularly, I can say it with good confidence, that this is only the end of one world. It is probably and very likely the end of a new world. And this new world, with the ideas such as you have, could be a much better world than the one we have. It's interesting also that this kind of breakdown, if you make the linear projections from the present to the future, will occur around the turn of the century, also the turn of the millennium. It's also a psychological factor involved. You know how much we are addicted to making New Year resolutions. That's only for 1 year. And a new decade comes. The international community undergoes a similar kind of self-delusion, if you like. I'm not saying that not all resolutions are kept, but I think many are not. But we adopt international development strategies, starting in the 1960s. Then in the 1970s, now we have the third development strategy in 1980s. Each one becomes more illusory than the next. Now, it's very likely that when we reach the late years of the 1990s and we're heading toward this psychological watershed, the year 2000, and the tensions climbing to this point, that this will accelerate, actually, the change and transformation, which will start the new millennium with something else. Don't forget, the human cost could be very high, and I will speak about it in a moment, how to try to minimize that. But tensions will be high. If you're lucky, we won't kill ourselves in the process. But certainly, large numbers of people will be exposed to deprivation. So, what will happen then? Well, here is where I don't hold an inevitability thesis. Here is where I say we have choices. And the choices will be very much up to us, already to make. I would like to draw for you now 2 scenarios, very briefly, and then in the last 10 minutes, if I may, Mr. Chairman, give you some ideas, some thoughts about what we could do today to choose the better one of the scenarios. To make it more interesting, I'll call one of them the apocalypse scenario and the other one the phoenix scenario. Now take the apocalypse scenario. Here we are around the turn of the century. We have small colonies now because people have moved out of the big cities. There's no way they can get services or employment or food. They're moving out to wherever there is a possibility of feeding themselves and possibility of creating communities that have some measure of sustainability and self-reliance. Where they are, they can communicate with one another. One of the remarkable facets of our communications technologies are that they are not energy intensive. They are small. They get ubiquitous, practically everywhere available. And chances are when everything goes down the drain, we will still have workable communication satellites. We will still have radios. And we will be able to communicate with one another. So the means of people getting in touch, even over large distances, I think will be there. Always, as I said, provided that there is no nuclear catastrophe. So they get together. They compare notes. It will turn out that some of these colonies have in their possessions stockpiles of arms, lethal arms. It will turn out that others don't. Some may have highly skilled people and unscrupulous people, others not. Maybe it will be much more genuine, honest, humanistic people. Under these circumstances, there will be power plays. It's very well possible that the more organized, the more power hungry will exploit the situation and will create new networks of dominance. You can spell out the scenario in some detail in my new book, which is just about to be published. I do so. The fact is that by means of coercion, by means of rhetoric, by means of communication, which is a neutral technology which can be used for good or for evil, as all technologies, we could create a world of terror, a world controlled by power centers in which the majority of mankind is subjugated. This world, of which Hitler dreamed of the thousand rewrite, could be a possibility. Could be a possibility to let it happen. If you're not prepared. It will be very difficult to reverse. Once you get to that point where there are large power centers, where people are forced to obey, it's difficult to break out of it. We know the recent terrorist regimes, they can be maintained if they have arms, if they have money. And this could be, the world could be rebuilt in such a mold if we are unlucky and if we are foolish. Would be catastrophic, would be tragic. But let me give you also this other scenario, the Phoenix scenario, which I think is very close to the Baha'i scenario. Communication is there. People get together. People come to a conclusion which is also fairly frequent after the wake of catastrophes, that it's better to pull together. It's better to pursue common goals. That we should learn from the mistakes of the past. That we should cooperate. That we should not be hungry for power to the extent where we destroy our world and ourselves. We could create self-reliant communities who can produce their own food, who can create employment for the people, who can make their own decisions. I think the Baha'i communities are prototype for this sort of scenario. These could establish relations with one another on the basis of self-reliance, because that famous word interdependence, which you usually hear in so-called progressive circles in a very positive connotation, I'm telling you, is a very dangerous concept. Because interdependence only works among equals. Then it's equal and friendly people. If you are interdependent with your enemy, you better watch out. And if your enemy is more powerful than you, being interdependent means being enslaved. So I think the new world would have to be much more self-reliant, locally self-reliant than the one we have built today. We have built this world too fast. We have built it through our technological, industrial capacities to global dimensions when we are psychologically and spiritually unprepared to live in a global world. We could, in this world, in this new scenario, decide to bury and to disassemble, defuse the major weapons. We could decide instead to put highest value on the fulfillment of needs on social needs, on spiritual needs, as well as physical needs. We could decide that we would not want to be in communication and in contact to such a strong extent with people whom we cannot trust, so that we can become dependent on them. We could decide that people of good faith could work together and could try to control their own unruly elements. This could be done because there will be a new mindset. You cannot go through a crisis unchanged. It's one of the great illusions and dangerous illusions of our epoch, to think that you go through an upheaval, a social, personal, economical, political upheaval, and you come out being pretty well the same as you were before. You don't. People have changed. I've seen it after the Second World War in Europe. I went through that as a child. And people came out being different. It was a great tragedy in my country, in Hungary, that they did not have a chance to become what they wanted to become, but they came under a new form of domination. So there are realistic possibilities, I think, for a Phoenix scenario. And on the basis of all the theoretical insight that I'm able to muster, I can tell you that groups that are now persecuted, now small, now powerless, will have their day, because all the centers that are repressing these groups will be gone. The forces of domination will be gone. The heavy hand of the past will have been lifted. And I don't see change coming in our lifetime in the absence of such a situation. But if you're going to make the Phoenix scenario more likely than the apocalypse one, we'll have to do a number of things. And it's not necessary that all people do it. It's enough that a few centers of awareness grow up in the world. And I think the Baha'i community is an ideal center of awareness distributed over the world for this kind of initiative. Let me just list a few of the things that we have to do. One, we have to create the ability to survive. This means not only physically survive, it does not mean equipping yourself with guns and hand grenades. It means being able to form communities that are not dependent on the system at large, that can produce their food, that can take care of the health and social needs of the people, of the spiritual needs, that can maintain themselves. I think we have many experiments of this kind. It's very remarkable that this kind of experimentation is growing up all over the world. We have to consciously foster this. The skills, the knowledge, the information, what it takes to be self-reliant and, if necessary, self-sufficient. Secondly, we have to take great care for the next generation. As I said, human nature is not immutable. It is strongly conditioned by political, economic, cultural reality. And it would be a tragic mistake if today we would brainwash our children, as education sometimes does, into a mindset which is on the way out. If you would train them for competition, for looking for the edge of competing over your most immediate rival, if you would train them for materialism, for possessiveness, for intolerance. No child is born with these qualities. Children are egalitarian by nature. We train them, we brainwash them into the kind of civilization that we have created. It will be tragic if this new generation, which is being born now, which is already here as young children, if this generation would receive an education which would make it difficult for them to transit into another world, which would predispose them to transit into a competitive, power-oriented, apocalypse type of scenario instead of the cooperative and solidarity type of scenario. So we have to take very much care of educating our children or letting them simply develop their own natural predispositions for solidarity, for lack of violence. The expert on it is Professor Danish, but I see from what he says that it is not an inherited, not a genetic, it's an acquired trait. It's a cultural factor. Then we have to do a number of other things as well. in addition to the human elements. We have to watch out that this vital are means of survival as a species, that those are not destroyed. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a real danger that they could be destroyed. And I don't mean only nuclear ways. We could destroy topsoils as we are doing now. Enormous amounts of topsoil are being destroyed year after year. They're diminishing the world over. The waters are getting polluted despite of occasional reversals and success stories, but on the whole, we are endangering our waterways. The air is getting worse, of course, you know that in big cities. Not to mention acid rain or other matters, particularly close to our friends from Canada. All of the usable, humanly usable natural resources that we have must be taken care of, and that means not only the non-renewable, also the renewable resources. This perhaps a seldom discussed fact that the world's deserts advance every year, roughly, by an area equivalent to the size of Maine. It's due to deforestation. Poor people cut down forests and burn it for firewood. We can also overgraze lands. The rainforests of the world could well disappear by the turn of the century if you continue cutting them down and clearing them for agriculture at the present rate. Not that it would even produce good agricultural land, because the unprotected soils wash away, as we have known it happen in the Amazons. So the ecological problems are very serious problems, because even with the best will in the world, with the best mindset in the world, we cannot create a world in which 6.5 billion people or so can live and satisfy their real physical needs if we are destroying the resources which they require for that. Then we have to do something about diffusing this nuclear threat, even if there is no nuclear war, a big if. But even if there isn't, the very presence of nuclear armaments, of stockpiles, would create a constant temptation, a constant threat to human well-being. It is not enough simply to refrain from deploying an increasing number of these weapons. We would also have to start destroying them. Again, this would be a fact that could come into increasing prominence as it turns out that there are no military solutions to the problems that we face. That the problems that we face are not imagined threats on the part of big powers, but real threats on the part of 4 or 5 billion people who simply do not know how to survive, have no means to survive. And perhaps under those circumstances we could make some steps in this direction. We would have to do so. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, also I can't say that the others are less important, we would have to prepare for what you know in your face as the age of maturity of mankind. We would have to start, I think as we do already, to preparing for this. We would have to create access to the public media. We would have to create community forums, probably doing all the things that you're doing already. But don't forget that many people are not doing it. And whether or not they profess the same faith or not, we would have to bring them into this awareness, knowing what the alternative is. We could try to simulate this new world. There are many ways of doing that. We could role play. We could have new science fiction, but the science fiction would not be intergalactic wars, but would be ways of managing a world which is emerging from the throes of a crisis and creating a new world. We could simulate new communities. We could simulate new ways of human interaction. We could create the technologies which would be simple, technologies in the sense that they wouldn't be capital intensive, they wouldn't cost a lot of money, and they wouldn't cost a lot of hardware. We now have technologies that are usable to almost everybody. We would have to prepare for this sort of thing. And our young people could very well be engaged in this. I think it's far more exciting to try to imagine what a world after this, which comes very soon, which would come in 20 years, which may come in 15 years, would look like, rather than escaping into these fantasies of science fiction, which are so popular today. All of these things can be done. There are many ways of doing this. But one final point I would like to make, to reiterate, I mentioned it already, that all of the empirical as well as theoretical evidence points to one fact, that when you have a major upheaval, then any small change, any small modification, innovation in the system, within the system, which was up till then dormant or suppressed, can become amplified. In fact, one of several will become amplified. This is how species evolve, the so-called isolates, the peripheral isolates. This is what happens in physical-chemical systems. When a small internal fluctuation becomes amplified and becomes the dominant regime of the system. This is what is applicable, I think, to human society, into this interdependent global society which we haven't learned to live in yet. That the new mutation will come about when the system dominance ceases, and those small groups that are ready for creating a world of global unity will have their day. I'm sure it will be your day, and I hope it will be the day of all of us. Thank you very much.